Welcome to Inside American Stories, the podcast where we uncover the untold stories behind America's most prominent families. I'm your host, Bradley Teller, and today we're diving deep into one of the Kennedy family's most closely guarded secrets, the story of Rosemary Kennedy, the sister who was hidden from the world for nearly her entire life. Picture this. It's 1960, and John F. Kennedy is running for President of the United States. The American public is fascinated by this young, vibrant political family. We see the handsome candidate, his glamorous wife Jackie, and we hear about his siblings, but there's one Kennedy sibling who's conspicuously absent from the campaign trail. The family's official story? She's living a quiet life as a teacher at a convent in New York. But that was a lie. A carefully constructed deception that would hide one of the most heartbreaking stories in American political history. Rosemary Kennedy, known as Rosemary or simply Rosie to her family, was born on September 13, 1918, the third child of Rose and Joseph Kennedy. In the early years, she seemed like any other Kennedy child. She was active, she was social, and she was loved deeply by her siblings. But the Kennedys weren't just any family. They were a family with towering ambitions, where perfection wasn't just encouraged, it was demanded. Rose Kennedy, the matriarch, later admitted in her memoir, Times to Remember, that her greatest ambition was for her children to be perfect in every way, morally, physically, and mentally. And here's where Rosemary's story begins to take a tragic turn. As she grew older, subtle differences began to emerge. She was slower than her siblings, had trouble with writing letters, what we might recognize today as dyslexia, and could be moody and difficult. But let me be crystal clear about something that's been distorted over the decades. Rosemary Kennedy was not intellectually disabled. She was a functioning young woman who could take care of her younger sister Eunice during trips to Switzerland, showing that her parents trusted her with real responsibility. She was athletic. She loved swimming and tennis. She was social. She participated actively in family gatherings. And she was capable, despite her challenges with writing. She managed to attend boarding school and perform academically. But in a family of overachievers destined for greatness, being different was dangerous. Let me paint you a picture of what summers were like for the Kennedy children. Every year, they'd gather at the family compound in Hyannisport, and these weren't lazy beach vacations. These were intensely competitive training grounds for future leaders of America. According to biographer Lawrence Leamer in The Kennedy Women, in 1935, the younger Kennedy siblings, led by Eunice, Kathleen, and Pat, alongside Rosemary, Jack, and Joe Jr., took home numerous prizes from the Hyannisport Yacht Club. Sailing wasn't just a hobby. It was another arena where Kennedy children were expected to excel. While her siblings attended prestigious boarding schools, convents for the girls, secular schools for the boys, Rosemary was initially homeschooled. When she finally did attend boarding school as a teenager, her letters to her father reveal something heartbreaking, a desperate desire to please and a deep fear of disappointing him. These letters, with their obvious writing difficulties, show us a young woman who was trying so hard to fit into a family mold that was never designed for someone like her. She wrote about her loneliness, but also about her determination to make her father happy. And here's what makes this even more tragic. Rosemary was actually easy to make happy. She loved receiving compliments, enjoyed dressing up, and was genuinely excited when family friends would ask her out. She wasn't demanding or difficult, she just wanted to belong. Perhaps the happiest period of Rosemary's life came when her father, Joseph Kennedy, was appointed ambassador to Great Britain. The family moved to London, and suddenly Rosemary found herself in a world where she could shine. In 1938, she was presented to King George VI and Queen Elizabeth at Buckingham Palace. Imagine this scene: Rosemary Kennedy, radiant in a white gown adorned with silver piping, curtsying before the British monarchs. She looked every inch the ambassador's daughter, poised and elegant. For once, she wasn't the Kennedy child who was struggling to keep up. She was simply Rosemary Kennedy, daughter of the American ambassador, being celebrated at one of the most prestigious courts in the world. But this golden period couldn't last forever. As World War II erupted and the family returned to America, Rosemary's challenges began to intensify. She was 21 now, and the pressures of adult life in a politically ambitious family were becoming overwhelming. Her parents began to suspect that something more serious than learning difficulties was affecting their daughter. She was having violent outbursts, periods of depression, and what we might recognize today as emotional breakdowns. Gore Vidal, the famous author who had ties to the Kennedy family, later noted that much of what we know about Rosemary's condition has been distorted over the years. But one thing is clear: she was struggling. Some doctors at the time suggested institutionalization, but Joe and Rose Kennedy initially resisted. They believed they could care for her better at home. They weren't ready to give up on their daughter. Not yet. By the fall of 1941, the Kennedy family was scattered. Jack was serving in the Naval Reserve, Kik was working for the Washington Times-Herald, and Joe Jr. was in naval training. The tight-knit family unit that had been Rosemary's support system was fragmenting. Rosemary had been enrolled at St. Gertrude's School of Arts and Crafts in Washington, D.C., a school specifically designed for girls with developmental delays. It was here that her behavior became increasingly concerning to her family. She began sneaking out at night. Now, for most young women in their early 20s, this might not be unusual behavior. But for the Kennedys, it represented their worst nightmare. The unspoken fear, the one that haunted Rose Kennedy in particular, was that Rosemary might become pregnant, or worse, be sexually assaulted during these nighttime adventures. Remember, this was 1941. The Kennedy political dynasty was still in its infancy, but Joe Sr. already had massive ambitions for his sons. A scandal involving Rosemary could derail everything he had worked toward. Rose Kennedy's memoir reveals the agony of this period. She had sought help from numerous doctors, all of whom suggested institutionalizing Rosemary. The family had even tried sending her to a Catholic boarding school, but she was unhappy with the confinement and continued to rebel. After a physical altercation between Rosemary and her paternal grandfather, Joe and Rose finally realized they were ill-equipped to handle her escalating issues. Something had to be done. And Joe Sr. thought he had found the answer. Somewhere in late 1941, Joseph Kennedy Sr. learned about a medical procedure that promised to solve all of Rosemary's problems. It was called a lobotomy, a surgical procedure that involved severing connections in the brain's prefrontal cortex. Today we know lobotomies as barbaric, ineffective procedures that destroyed more lives than they helped. But in 1941, some doctors were promoting them as miracle cures for everything from depression to anxiety to what they termed difficult behavior in women. For Joe Kennedy, a man accustomed to solving problems through action and influence, this seemed like the perfect solution. One procedure, and Rosemary could be fixed. She could become the perfect Kennedy daughter he needed her to be. But here's the crucial detail that makes this story even more tragic. Joe Sr. made this decision without consulting his wife or any of his other children. Rose Kennedy, by most accounts, didn't know about the lobotomy until after it had been performed. Looking back now with our modern understanding of mental health, it's likely that Rosemary was experiencing what we might diagnose as bipolar disorder or severe depression. With today's medications and therapeutic approaches, she could have lived a full, productive life. She might have had moments of crisis, but she could have remained herself, the athletic, social, loving young woman her siblings remembered. Instead, she underwent a procedure that would rob her of her personality, her independence, and her future. The lobotomy was a disaster. The vibrant, if troubled, young woman who entered surgery was gone forever. What happened to Rosemary immediately after her lobotomy remains shrouded in secrecy, but we know the results were catastrophic. The procedure, rather than calming her or improving her behavior, left her severely disabled. She could barely speak, had difficulty walking, and required constant care. Joe Kennedy's solution had destroyed his daughter. For several years, Rosemary was kept at Craig House in Beacon, New York, away from her family. But Joe Sr. knew this arrangement couldn't be permanent. He needed advice, and he turned to someone he trusted implicitly, Richard Cardinal Cushing of Boston, the family's spiritual advisor. Cardinal Cushing's advice was clear. Rosemary needed to be kept away from the public eye to prevent her from becoming either a subject of sympathy or a source of embarrassment for the family. For their mental peace, and for the protection of the family's political future, Rosemary needed to disappear. 3 weeks after Cushing's correspondence with Kennedy, arrangements were made. The St. Coletta School for Exceptional Children in Jefferson, Wisconsin had agreed to take Rosemary. Mother Mary Bartholomew, the Mother Superior, assured Kennedy that all arrangements would be made to his satisfaction. In the spring of 1942, Rosemary Kennedy was transferred to what would become her permanent home. She would live there for the next 64 years, until her death in 2005 at the age of 86. Joe Kennedy had arranged for the construction of a special house for Rosemary within the grounds of the Alverno nursing home, owned by St. Coletta's. The staff would later name it the Kennedy Cottage, a bitter irony, since Rosemary was now more isolated from her Kennedy family than ever before. Let me describe the place that became Rosemary Kennedy's world. St. Coletta's was spread over a vast, picturesque landscape with lush fields, parks, gardens, and a farm that supplied fresh produce for the residents. The school buildings were typical multi-story brick structures, and the campus included a church, a chapel, an auditorium for entertainment, swimming pools, recreational facilities, and even a cemetery for past residents and nuns. Rosemary lived in her ranch-style cottage about a mile away from the main campus, cared for by 2 nuns from the St. Francis of Assisi order. She would visit the main campus for church services, Saturday movie nights, and special events. Sister Joseph Marie, who worked at the Alverno nursing home from 1973 through 1999, remembered Rosemary as being like a little child in many ways. Despite her mental limitations, Rosemary maintained a strong presence. Her expressive eyes and dark hair that remained black even in her later years made her a memorable figure. She displayed a full range of emotions and could cause quite a scene when she wanted to. Sister Joseph Marie would visit her regularly, reading to her from magazines and watching game shows together. While Rosemary recognized all of her siblings when they visited, she seemed to have difficulty comprehending their celebrity status or understanding when they died. The nuns cared for her well, but their methods sometimes clashed with her family's expectations. They frequently gave Rosemary chocolate as a reward, so much so that it became a source of concern for Rose Kennedy, who worried about her daughter's weight and dental health. When Rose complained, the nuns defended their approach, saying chocolate was one of Rosemary's few pleasures in life. And perhaps that tells us everything we need to know about what Rosemary's life had become, reduced to such simple pleasures that chocolate was considered one of her few sources of joy. For 8 years after Rosemary's commitment to St. Coletta's, she had no contact with her family. Joseph Kennedy had forbidden Rose and the other children from visiting her. It wasn't until 1949, 8 long years, that Rose Kennedy first saw her daughter again. What Rose found must have been devastating. The athletic, social, vibrant young woman who had once sailed with her siblings and danced at embassy parties was gone. In her place was a woman who could barely communicate, who needed constant care, who would never again be the Rosemary they had known and loved. But the Kennedy political machine was just getting started, and Rosemary's existence posed a constant threat to their carefully crafted image. So they did what they did best. They created a story. During JFK's 1960 presidential campaign, when reporters asked about the missing Kennedy daughter, the family claimed that Rosemary was living a quiet life as a convent teacher in Tarrytown, New York. It was a complete fabrication, but it served its purpose. The public first got a hint of the truth in July 1960, when Time magazine published an article in which Joseph Kennedy mentioned that Rosemary had suffered from spinal meningitis and was recovering in a Wisconsin nursing home. Even this was misleading. Spinal meningitis suggested a medical condition rather than the deliberate surgical procedure that had actually disabled her. 2 years later, in September 1962, Eunice Kennedy Shriver wrote an essay for the Saturday Evening Post that presented a revised version of events. She wrote that in 1941, Rosemary had been taken to numerous doctors who all said her condition wouldn't improve and that she'd be happier in an institution. Eunice expressed sadness that this move might not have been necessary with modern knowledge, a statement that was tragically true, though not in the way she implied. Crucially, Eunice's essay made no mention of the lobotomy. According to family lore, none of them knew about the procedure until after Joseph Kennedy's death in 1969, when family members finally started asking questions. But this seems almost impossible to believe. Surely Rose Kennedy, visiting her dramatically changed daughter, would have realized what had happened. After Joseph Kennedy Sr.'s death in 1969, everything changed for Rosemary. Suddenly, she had visitors again. Her siblings, led by Eunice Kennedy Shriver, began making regular trips to Wisconsin. Eunice, in particular, was determined that Rosemary should remain part of the Kennedy family, despite the challenges her condition presented. By the mid-1970s, it became easier to bring Rosemary to visit them rather than having the entire family travel to Wisconsin. In the winter of 1975, Eunice arranged for 57-year-old Rosemary to leave St. Coletta's for a family visit to Palm Beach, Florida. These visits, though well-intentioned, were often traumatic for Rosemary. She felt out of place and uncomfortable in the grand Kennedy homes, leading to mood swings and agitation that would sometimes take weeks to settle after she returned to Wisconsin. During that 1975 Palm Beach visit, we get a glimpse of the complicated dynamics that had developed. Rosemary's mood would brighten considerably when Eunice and her sister Jean arrived. She clearly loved and recognized her siblings. Eunice spent the week caring for Rosemary, reminiscing about family history, and taking notes about her sister's needs. But there was also tension. During one incident, Eunice tried to encourage Rosemary to swim by roughly pushing her into the water, behavior that alarmed the nuns who had accompanied Rosemary. When they complained to Rose Kennedy about Eunice's handling of Rosemary, Rose defended her daughter, citing Eunice's work with the Special Olympics, and curtly told the nuns to mind their own business. It's a telling moment. Even decades after the lobotomy, the Kennedy family still struggled to understand Rosemary's needs and limitations. Rosemary Kennedy lived at St. Coletta's for 64 years, until her death in January 2005 at the age of 86. Think about that. She spent more than 3/4 of her life in that Wisconsin institution, hidden away from the world that had once celebrated her family's achievements. Her sister Jean once said that Rosemary was content and well-loved by the nuns and her fellow residents. Rose Kennedy, writing decades after Rosemary's placement, maintained that her daughter was physically healthy and generally happy, living life to the fullest within her limitations. She could occasionally go out for personal shopping, always accompanied by an attendant, and was completely at ease in her environment. But we have to ask ourselves, was this really contentment, or was it simply resignation? Was Rosemary truly happy, or had she simply adapted to a life that was chosen for her by others? The tragedy of Rosemary Kennedy isn't just that she underwent a barbaric medical procedure. It's that she was sacrificed on the altar of her family's ambitions. Her father, so determined to protect the Kennedy political dynasty, made a decision that destroyed his daughter's life and then spent decades covering it up. But there's another side to this story, one that speaks to something more hopeful. Eunice Kennedy Shriver's work with the Special Olympics, which began in the 1960s and continues today, was directly inspired by her experiences with Rosemary. In trying to honor her sister's memory and advocate for people with intellectual disabilities, Eunice created a global movement that has touched millions of lives. In her 1962 Saturday Evening Post essay, Eunice wrote that mental retardation can happen in any family, regardless of their status or wealth. It was a revolutionary statement for its time, a Kennedy admitting publicly that their family wasn't perfect, that they too had struggles and challenges. As Rosemary Kennedy's story ends, imagine who she might have been with today's care, living independently, loving swimming and tennis, maybe even using her voice for disability rights. Instead, she was hidden, her life sacrificed for a family's image. Yet her existence forced change. It inspired Eunice's advocacy and taught us the cost of valuing perfection over people. Her story reminds us that behind every public life are private struggles, and that compassion should always come before appearance. Curious how one choice shaped a presidency and sparked a nationwide movement? Hear the letters, interviews, and untold moments that reveal the truth. Download the Skoob app now to get access to the full story. Thank you for listening to Inside American Politics. Join us next week for another untold American story.